Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Vinimos acá a Kuala Lumpur, vamos a juntarnos con un economista, Srinivas se llama su nombre. Vamos a hablar no solamente de Malasia, sino que vamos a hablar también de Singapur. Y lo que me interesa también del perfil de este economista es justamente que también es productor, o sea, tiene tanto, es responsable de una planta tanto en Malasia y tiene que también trabaja junto con Singapur. Es economista, entiende la economía no solamente en términos teóricos, sino que también lo pone en práctica por medio del manejo de empresas. Así que me parece súper interesante lo que nos pueda decir, así que vamos a conversar con él y nos metemos de lleno en la entrevista. Acordate siempre para seguir haciendo este contenido que le puedes dar like, que puedes compartir y que te tenés que suscribir, por favor, así nos ayudás a seguir creciendo. Muchas gracias y vamos a la entrevista.
Srinivas. I'm a co-founder of a snack chip brand in Singapore and Malaysia, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. And I have an economic background as well. Yeah, I did. Yeah, so I think for Malaysia, it's much more a resource-based economy. So Malaysia is super rich in raw materials, oil, crude oil, palm oil. It used to be rubber to a large extent, now less so. So Malaysia's economy started more with that. With time now, they've actually started focusing more on manufacturing as well. So manufacturing of various products, so petrochemicals, so more value-added stuff, chips, electro chips, and this is actually becoming really important now in Malaysia. So it used to be just resource focused, now they're moving towards manufacturing and other services. Singapore, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. It's not a country with resources, so everything started off with services. So it's the financial hub for the region. It's also very good at logistics, transportation, the port, and also it actually has a very good semiconductor industry as well. So Malaysia is more manufacturing and resource based. Singapore is more services but very high-end manufacturing. So I would say this is the difference between the two. Yeah, so in Singapore, actually the state is very good at creating a framework for a new industry to thrive. So in Singapore, the thing is, every like 5 or 10 years, the state will have a new focus. So for example, in the last 10 years, they had a really big focus on e-commerce, and as a result of which there's so many large e-commerce companies. So like Mercado Libre in Argentina, we have our own like champions of the region. And 10 years before that, the focus would have been on biotech. Before that, it was on trading, commodities, etc. So the Singapore government is very good at identifying like focus areas for next 5-10 years of growth and creating a framework for it. And then afterwards it's all like private enterprise which does. So I wouldn't say the state involvement isn't in creating companies but more in creating the framework. In Malaysia it's a little bit different because one of the largest companies, if not the largest, is the national petroleum company called Petronas. So it's just Petroleum Nasional Berhad, State Petroleum Corporation. So the state has, I would say, a slightly larger presence in Malaysia, but even underneath the state, there's a lot of private enterprise as well, which is done extremely well. So maybe in Malaysia, the state is actually in the last, I would say 10 years, in my experience as an entrepreneur in Malaysia, the state is super supportive in terms of providing the right framework, the right incentives, tax schemes, grants, etc., etc. So, like Malaysia and Singapore are like becoming more and more similar, because Malaysia would have seen Singapore's example, Singapore would have seen Malaysia's example. So with time, it's not like 20 years ago when there was very different. Now, even though Singapore is higher in GDP per capita, Malaysia is slightly lower, but then they're actually like keeping track with Singapore. And the good thing is, like, think of it like an economic union. So for example, most Singapore companies like ours will have the factory in Malaysia, because you can manufacture in Malaysia and export, but then the finance, operations, marketing will be done from Singapore. So it's like an American company which will have the HQ in the US, but manufacturing in Mexico, because it's so much cheaper. So for us, it works well because the Malaysian ringgit, the currency, is super cheap. It's actually depreciated a lot and very cheap in US dollar terms. Therefore, it makes economic sense to like manufacture in Malaysia, but you can have financing other things from Singapore. A lot of companies do this. So I would say it's really well established in Singapore. Like you should read Singapore, the ex-Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's book. He has a really excellent book called From Third World to First. And basically he says that the most important thing for anybody coming into any country is the airport and the airport experience, because you will form your entire opinion about the country just in that 1 or 2 hours in the airport, which is why Singapore airport is frankly the best in the world. Not just the airport, but the journey from the airport to the city as well, because this is it's your first impression and your last impression, which you will always remember. So this speaks to transport in Singapore. In that sense, it's really world class. Same with health and education as well. So in Singapore, the state plays a large part in these things, health, education, transport, but there's also like loads of private companies, especially in education and health, which will fulfill like a different purpose to the state. In Malaysia, you also have it, but I think it's not as well developed as in Singapore. Health, education, transport, it's all there. So for example, like when this Malaysia airport, the one that you're going to go from today, when it was built in 1998, it was the best airport in the world, seriously. Mm-hmm. Or like top 10, I remember as a child just being like so like struck by it. But the thing is, like nearly 30 years later, nothing has changed. So it was the best airport then, but nothing has been updated. This is the problem, and they're now really seriously like considering updating it and changing it, but that will happen with time. So the state, but in both countries, maybe more so in Malaysia, wherever there's a deficit, even in the country. So this is Auntie's tea. You should try it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a sweet Malaysian tea which is very famous. Thank you, Auntie. So I hope you enjoy it. So in Malaysia, like wherever there's a deficit from the state, you will find a lot of private companies like providing that service, mostly in healthcare and education, same as in India. So I think the example here with India is more relevant because the state in India cannot take care of 1.4 or 1.5 billion people. This has given a lot of opportunities for private companies to become kind of world class in health, education, IT, etc. In that way, the best thing the state could do in India is not get involved, which is why these companies were able to come up. So this is an example in India of zero state involvement, especially in the early stages, especially in IT, because the government didn't do anything is why these companies were able to come up very, very quickly. But now they have regulations, etc., etc. So I think the Indian example is like much more relevant. State doesn't do anything. Private enterprise took over a lot of the requirements. Absolutely, there is. So in Singapore, there's two. One is called GIC, Government Investment Corporation, and the other is Temasek. Both are sovereign wealth funds, and they kind of like invest. They've been extremely successful in investing early in Facebook. So many of these companies. Even in Malaysia, there's one called Khazanah Nasional Berhad, which is the same model as Temasek. And they're actually like Khazanah in Malaysia is a world-class firm. They invest really well. So many of these deals, Facebook, maybe not Uber, Airbnb, a lot of these Khazanah would have had an involvement as well. They invest now very heavily in like e-commerce sector in India, Middle East. The idea is, that they could get back these learnings to Singapore. So in that sense, Khazanah is as good as Temasek, in my opinion. So they're both comparable. So I think in the case of Malaysia, like the best thing the state can do is nothing in the case of investment, because it's all run by like professionals in Khazanah and in Temasek. It's all people who have been to kind of very good universities, and it's run professionally. The state
is a private company.
It's run like a private company, but they have to, ultimately the state is the owner, but the state doesn't get involved on a day-to-day basis. It's this. The problem is in Malaysia, there used to be another sovereign wealth fund called 1MDB that became the largest corruption case. That was the problem when the state got involved. So the best thing for the state to do is just leave it to professionals, which is why they're so successful. It's one of the biggest successes of Singapore, because I don't know if it like is similar to the UK experience, because in Britain they always believe that every person should have their own home, or it used to be a nation of homeowners, because with that you can build equity in your home, borrow against that, and it goes back into the economy. So in my opinion, one of the biggest successes in Singapore is the Housing Development Board, because I think 80% of people live in government housing, and these are not cheap. Like, it goes to like nearly $1 million Singapore dollars, so it's actually it's kind of expensive. So 80% would live in HDBs, 15% would live in private apartments, or 16%, and only 4% would live in private houses. So like not apartments, but like landed houses, as they're called. But I would say it's like one of the biggest policy successes for Singapore, because it was managed professionally, and these blocks, they have a quota. You can't have a block just with one group. You have to have, it has to be like reflective of the population at large. So it has to have, 60-70% of Chinese and Malay and Indian. So I actually think it's one of the best things about Singapore. It's not looked at in the same way in Singapore. Like in Malaysia, it's there, of course, but it's not comparable at all. Not at all. It's unique to Singapore, and it's like a huge success in Singapore. In Malaysia, not so much. But then again, Malaysia is a much larger country than Singapore, so people can have
it's more difficult to.
Yeah, exactly. People can have even smaller houses slightly further away, etc. And Malaysia, like, it's a land of car owners, because petrol is so cheap, because the nation produces crude oil. So one of the cheapest gas prices or petrol prices in the world is in Malaysia, which is why for transport, to answer your question, it's not as much of a problem, because everybody has, a lot of people have cars, and car ownership is in the culture, whereas in Singapore, it's extremely difficult to own a car. The question is, like, as a principle, I think it's interesting, but then what happens to healthcare, education, transport? Transport also, you can kind of privatize it, but then certain things you can't like leave to the private sector, I feel, especially healthcare. Healthcare, education. So I think if there are certain institutions which are super crucial to the state, and if you destroy them, what will take its place? Let's say with time something will take its place, but then what will happen in the next 5 years till that solution comes through? Like, the question is, who's willing to bell the cat? Which is the generation which will suffer, is willing to suffer more than it already has since this devaluation in Argentina, in order to like wait? I don't think that's like political suicide for any like politician to do that, but I think it sounds like a great idea, but then it can't be without some period of adjustment and suffering for people. The question is, are people willing to accept that? No, but I mean, firstly, I guess the reason for Singapore's growth is, of course, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the ex-Prime Minister. This is the truth, because he was a really like visionary, 100%. And because when Malaysia and Singapore used to be one country, and Singapore was kicked out of the Union, which Singapore didn't want at the time, but now Singapore is kind of much more developed than Malaysia. So in that sense, it was necessary for whatever PAP did and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew did. But the question is, Singapore is it's a small country with only today 6 million people, and it's easier to control in that way. But let's look at it this way. There's certain policy successes in Singapore, for example, Temasek that you were saying. I think Singapore did Temasek much before others. And looking at Singapore, other countries started it. Kazana as well definitely has influence from Temasek. So I think you can take out certain things which Singapore has done, but you have to localize it and make it relevant. So the question is you can't be 100% like it, because the circumstances are different. But if it's the Argentine examples, it has so much natural beauty, natural resources, so many things. I guess only have to play to those trends, and I guess make enterprise easier. To put it to give you an example, one of my really good friends from university was from Argentina, and he still works for Mercado Libre, but then he wasn't able to live in Argentina anymore, and he moved to Mexico. But he is Argentine, really well-educated guy, really intelligent. So I think the country should be encouraging private entrepreneurs to stay back. Only then will things change, in my opinion. Yeah. So I think economic brain drain is something to avoid. So I think inflation is there everywhere in the world. But I guess in Malaysia, depends on what kind of inflation. I guess fuel price inflation affects Malaysia less because it's a fuel producer. Food inflation has affected Singapore and Malaysia greatly. But the question is, what are they going to do about it now? During COVID, prices went up, I think, everywhere in the world, including in Malaysia and Singapore. So now both countries want to encourage local growth of, whatever crops, agriculture, whatever is possible, growing fish, livestock, etc. So I think inflation is there, but what are you going to do about it for the next 5, 10, 20 years? And how are you going to have self-sufficiency, at least in certain kinds of food? So I think that's very important. So even if there's inflation, you can't just say, okay, there's inflation, there's nothing we can do about it. You have to change the makeup of the industry to combat it. So which is something both countries are doing really well. And in terms of unemployment, etc., in the case of Malaysia, they're really encouraging more manufacturing. And in my opinion, the best place to manufacture in the world is Malaysia, because I think it's like a world-class country in terms of, you can get, whatever cuisines you want. It's multicultural. People speak 2 or 3 languages on average. So, and you have the benefit of it being very cheap versus the US dollar. And there's labor available. Used to be a problem, not so much now. So I think the best place to manufacture many industries, in my opinion, is Malaysia. So that will always see it through. In the case of Singapore, it's a financial hub, but Singapore is evolving every 5 or 10 years. And you will see this as well. Every 5, 10 years, they'll have a new focus. So I think the question is, what is going to be the focus the next 5 or 10 years in Singapore? The good thing is Singapore government is always good at creating a framework for new jobs of the next industry. So in the last 10 years, e-commerce, IT, it's really picked up as the government focused on it. Next, I think they'll have actually some more focus on local manufacturing, agriculture, all these kinds of things, and very high-end manufacturing. So that will kind of provide employment for the next 5 or 10 year cycle. So I think that's the difference between the two countries. Mm-hmm. But if I were to invest more, 100% manufacturing in Malaysia makes a lot of sense, and I'm very confident about it.
Bueno, espero que les haya gustado esta entrevista, que pudimos aquí robar un poquito de tiempo para conversar sobre los temas de Malasia y de Singapur, así que desde ya pueden compartir, dar like y suscribirse desde ya al canal, y seguimos con más charlas con economistas a lo largo del mundo.